Joe, I can't hear you. Your microphone's off.
Thank you. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? Sorry. I only had one cup of coffee this morning. My apologies. Um, so before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things. Um, the Q&A box is the place to put questions. If you could pop any questions or comments in there, and I will weave them in as we progress. That's how I typically will manage questions rather than leaving them to the end. We're recording this so that if you need to watch it or listen to it again, you have got the ability to do that. We'll be putting that up on our YouTube channel in the next day or so. So before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I'm coming to you from today, the land of the Ngunnawal people. I live on about an hour out of Canberra on the border of Canberra and New South Wales. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to all of those, to wherever you're coming from today as well. Thank you very much for joining us. So today we're looking at engaging with the new federal government, particularly from a perspective of organisations who may be based in Queensland. And obviously it's a different environment there. Obviously each state's different and we have different state governments in each state. The beginning of the webinar will cover off looking at the federal government itself, and then it will, after that, we'll then focus on how you can think about the new federal government or the re-elected federal government in the context of being a Queensland-based organisation. But the bulk of the webinar will be focusing on the federal sphere. Please feel free to pop any questions or comments that you'd like in the Q&A box. And of course, as always, really happy to answer your questions or take a call with you offline. We did New South Wales yesterday and, always happy to engage with people. Questions are always a great thing. And being inquisitive, that always helps. So let's start. What are we going to cover today? Background, how did Labor win? What's different in this election? What's next? And sorry, just wanted to make that stop jumping. We'll be looking at the Senate and also forward outlook, how to engage federally. And then for Queensland organisations in approaching engagement, things are different in Queensland than some other states. Some states have got a Labor government. In Queensland, there's an LNP government. And so how does that impact on things for you? So let's think about the election more broadly. First of all, Labor's win was much bigger than many people expected. I think that's fair to say. Even within the party itself, a lot of people thought that they, get in with a small majority or perhaps even end up in a minority. We worked very closely with pollsters YouGov, who many of you would probably know, and we did 3 webinars with them over the election and just after, and they were the only pollster to predict a majority government in the size that it was. I think their upper limit of lower house seats was 86. Obviously, it's a little more than that. It's 94, but they were predicting that. I almost sort of, didn't believe it. As many of you know, I'm a former advisor to the Rudd and Gillard and governments and the British Labor Party as well. And so it was not something that I quite thought would happen. But I think these extra seats that perhaps came in were as a result of similar circumstances to some of the other seats where those aspirational people who were in the mortgage belt just didn't want to buy what they were being sort of offered from the coalition, and so seats like Banks and Hughes swung to Labor, and in some senses not so for many decades. So it was a really interesting result in some seats, and particularly in urban areas. The campaign was really focused, obviously. The Labor campaign, particularly, was very focused and disciplined. It stuck to the issues that mattered most to people, and mainly the cost of living, which came up again and again as the number one thing that voters wanted to talk about. Now, we'll get to what did they reject in a minute, but I think in many respects it was a simple strategy, a steady, practical plan that Labor put forward that directly spoke to those concerns. And it was a sort of a clear, safe option, and one that a lot of Australians felt comfortable backing. What was really interesting, and I think will be the source of some scrutiny from both parties in many respects, was the trend that people were picking up at polling booths, where a lot of people weren't taking how to votes. When you're at a polling booth, people sort of try and thrust these things into your hand, and they are a guide to how you may or may not vote. The overwhelming majority of people, or a very large percentage of people, um, weren't taking those how to votes, and scrutineering has sort of detected that a lot of people were voting in a way that they wanted. So that was in a very independent, autonomous way. And so how to votes weren't being followed. What's the ramification of that for parties? What's the message in that for parties? Are people not necessarily being led by parties anymore? They're not necessarily seeing themselves as a baked on or a Labor voter or a Liberal voter. They're seeing themselves as someone who has to vote, needs to make a decision, and then makes a decision based on what they're seeing each time. So I think that's something that will play out in the parties' reviews, for sure. So I think that's probably, I think that's probably a reasonable summation of why people thought Labor won. Let's just get down to a little bit more detail. What's different after this election? What are we seeing? So for the first time in history, Labor's left faction, that's the faction that the Prime Minister has come from. You need to obviously note that once the Prime Minister, or in fact any Labor leader, becomes the leader of the party, they step out of the factional system. They don't attend faction meetings. Factions are sort of a loose alliance of people with some shared values on nuanced issues. They were much more profound some decades ago, but they still exist as, I suppose, a grouping to galvanise support, both on a state basis and perhaps sometimes a philosophical one as well. But for the first time in history, the Labor's left faction now holds more seats in the Labor caucus, or people in the Labor caucus, than the right. So this is quite interesting turn in events, which is interesting. That sets up across obviously the Senate and the House combined, is that characterises or forms the Labor caucus, what it's called. Historically, it's the largest Labor grouping ever in the House of Representatives. And at the same time, we're looking at the smallest coalition in years, the worst result in over 70 years. And as we've seen in the last few weeks, the coalition isn't unified, and I'm not sure the electorate is seeing them as unified just because of some of the things that have happened. They've sort of split, then they've got back together. There's obviously some pretty significant differences of opinion, both within the Liberal Party itself and the Liberal Party and the National Party. So the National Party has views on some issues, and the Liberal Party has other views on those issues. And one of the things that was interesting, I'm not sure whether or not David Littleproud will be staying as leader for all that much longer. It'll be really interesting to see whether when and where he will be challenged. But he brought to the National Party room a proposal to break with the cabinet or shadow cabinet solidarity. Now, that means that the shadow cabinet, a combination of Liberals and Nationals, once they'd made a decision on a certain issue, would then vote together on the floor of the Parliament. Now, that's something that he wanted to break. He wanted to say, yes, we'll sit with you as a shadow cabinet, but on the floor of Parliament, we want to be able to do our own thing. It's now surfaced that he sort of freelanced on that. That was not something that was raised at the National Party room, and so it'd be really interesting to see whether he pays for that, taking that sort of freelancing on that issue. Susan Lee rejected that. It was one of the reasons why they broke a split in the first place. And they also had a few other issues in terms of some significant policy issues, which the Liberals gave in on. So it's obviously more, though, complicated than just the numbers we see on the floor of the Parliament. We've got a very big Labor group. We have 64 Labor backbenchers, 30 Labor ministers and outer ministers. So the whole total ministry, 20 in the cabinet and 10 in the outer ministry. It's a very big group of Labor MPs, 94 in total. It's looking at that, one would think that you would, you know, characterize it as a landslide. Some people have defined it as that. But if you look at the numbers itself, I think it belies sort of more complicated story. And I think everyone needs to remember that. I think the government certainly will be. You saw just a 2% move on the primary vote, it would result in a very different amount of numbers of seats in the lower house. And so I think the government's going to be very mindful of that. And if that is the case, they'll be, and we'll get to how their tone and behaviour might be in the next few years. But I think Labor will be mindful of that. You've got to remember that the first preference vote for both parties has dropped significantly compared to historic levels. A couple of decades ago, you had Labor up to and the coalition hovering around 50% when they won government. Nothing like that now. It's the low 30s, mid 30s. And we continue to see a increase in independent people voting for independents or voting for other parties, giving their first preference vote to other parties other than the major parties. So what does that mean? Whilst Labor does have an increased mandate, it's not a landslide. It's certainly not something I wouldn't want to characterise it as a landslide. I don't think that the MPs themselves will want to say that. The numbers, how they have fallen, are very strong, but it's it's more complicated than just saying everyone ran to an extraordinary group of they were sort of drawn to Labor and Labor's message and Labor's mantra and Labor's agenda. I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's more of a rejection of what the coalition was offering rather than a full embrace of Labor as such. Remember, if anyone's got any comments or questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. So what is going to happen in the Senate? Well, just overnight, we've seen yet another move. A Western Australian Green senator has defected to Labor, Corinda Cox, and that's changing the numbers in the Senate. It still means that Labor needs to get either the support of the coalition or the Greens to pass legislation. But what it does mean is that the Greens can't group, if no one in the Labor Party breaks that group, and probably you would think not, I would imagine, joining Labor. Senator Cox, it's been made very clear to her that she's not going to be able to break that party voting approach in the Senate, the Liberals and the Greens, or the coalition and the Greens, aren't able to block legislation as they were able to in the last Senate. So her defection to Labor means that the blocking mechanism is not as easy. Now, of course, the coalition and the Greens and the other crossbenchers can group together to block legislation. We're talking about David Pocock, Tammy Tyrrell, Jackie Lambie, and One Nation. And there are 4 One Nation senators in the Senate now, the same number as the Nationals. And of course, they could all group together to block something that's possible, less possible because it's a difficult combination philosophically of all of those people. So to be able to pass legislation in the Senate, which obviously is very important, you've got to pass it through both chambers. Labor needs to secure the support of the coalition in their entirety, or they need to secure the support of the Greens in their entirety in order to get legislation through. So what's next? Well, the coalition's officially reunited after Liberal leader Susan Lee and Nationals leader David Littleproud reached a formal agreement. The Nationals secured 6 shadow cabinet roles, one less than Littleproud initially sought. Now, uncertainty was something that worked in Labor's favour during the election. Now, the key challenge is delivering on the agenda that they took to the election. They don't want to continue this sort of fear. They don't want the electorate to have a sort of pervasive fear of uncertainty, and how you stabilise things in the face of some of the things that are happening. We'll get to that in a minute. Is going to be the key thing, I think. One area I think when we need to think about is the area of productivity. It's going to be delivering on productivity and the economic gains with the budget that comes from that will be able to allow Labor to be bolder than perhaps the agenda that they took to the election. So if any of you are working in an area where productivity is something that you can talk with or talk to with government, I would urge you to do that. It's something that they'll be very attuned to, and they'll be interested to discuss that with you if you're a peak body or it's something that you're able to raise with them. I think it's something that's well worth thinking about. Jim Chalmers has flagged it as a priority, and the Productivity Commission is currently running an inquiry into what's really driving or holding back productivity in Australia. So it's going to be a fundamental thing, and we've just seen this morning the Fair Work Commission has raised the minimum wage by 3.5%. Labor and the ACTU would argue that that's going to increase productivity. I would think that's probably one of the arguments that they took to the Fair Work Commission. I haven't examined the arguments that were raised there, but I would dare say that incentivizing workers is and giving them, it was I think 1 point something higher than inflation. And I heard Sally McManus talk about the fact that for the first time in many years, sorry, I'm just about to cough. In first time in many years, workers on the minimum wage, or indeed all workers are going to get the pay rise, are able to be slightly 1 step ahead of inflation. So, they were interviewing someone who worked in, I think, a fast food place or some sort of shop or something, and she earned $650 a week. That's to give you a sense of the sorts of earnings that people on those sorts of wages are getting. So what's the outlook after this result? I would dare say, and I want to say for everyone listening, that I think nothing can be assured or guaranteed in elections. I, for one, and I'm sure many of you on the line were thinking that the coalition looked like they may have been in a winning position for many months, and certainly as close as February in this year, the polls were indicating the coalition was in a election winning position. So we all know what happened. Um, we think we do. The coalition raised a number of issues that weren't palatable to the electorate. So working from home, they wanted to bring that to an end for public servants. They raised the fact that they were going to make a large group of 40 something thousand plus people redundant or sack them. There was a lot of movement on how that was going to happen. There was a lot of change to that policy. First of all, it was going to be natural attrition. It was just going to be Canberra, and then it was going to be the regions. So I think what that uncertainty did was put in the minds of a lot of public servants all over the country and their families and their communities, what does this mean? And I think when people, and remember that people engage with news, political news, in lots of different ways. If all of us sort of examined where our news sources were that are sitting here today, it would all be different. And some people engage things in a very, very cursory, superficial way. And so they may see second, third hand reports from friends on TikTok or Facebook or wherever, or just anecdotally at a shop or wherever it is. And so I think the implications of that were interpreted by the election as the coalition were going to take things away rather than give us things, and Labor then kept the agenda in a very simple, straightforward, positive territory. It was as simple as that in many respects. So based on how the seats have fallen, including a couple of unexpected results we talked about a little earlier, it's unlikely the coalition can win majority government at the next election. But as I say never. Uh, you just don't know what's going to happen in the world between now and the next 3 years, do we? But based on how things are at the moment, it's unlikely. It'll very much, I think, depend on the domestic performance, perception, the behaviour of the re-elected government, and the strength and impact of international headwinds. We see President Trump, on the daily, sometimes more than daily, changing his views on issues like global tariffs and other things, Gaza, Ukraine. And so all those things really do create a sense of uncertainty in global markets, which has an impact on Australian markets. And also, I suppose, just the news. And in many respects, I think people were not wanting to buy into that. There was a sense that perhaps the coalition were going to be closer to that agenda than Labor might have been. And interestingly, when we may have first thought about what Trump might have done to the political environment here, we may not have predicted it. But I think the uncertainty and the perhaps perception that there was some proximity between the coalition and Trump's agenda didn't play well for the coalition. So if the Prime Minister continues to perform like he did in the election, and I'm one of these people who sort of watch TV and news and radio all day, every day, he seems to be very steady as you go at the moment. I don't think he's been displaying hubris, like him or not. And I don't think there was a huge amount of the electorate who he's not necessarily a Winston Churchill or a Robert Menzies or a Gough Whitlam figure, but he was the perhaps more palatable of the two offerings, or was the more palatable of the two offerings. So if it continues to perform like he did in the election and his government delivers and does not become complacent or arrogant, it's likely that it'll be returned for a third term. So what does that place us? I think what that means for us is that we need to think really clearly about how we're going to discuss, our agenda with the government. What's possible, I think, obviously, for the next election is a reduced Labor majority, or if things go really bad for Labor or the coalition performs exceedingly well, perhaps we'll see a Labor minority government, but I think it's probably more likely that we'll see a reduced majority. But as we say, we never know. So what's the government going to be? Is it going to be cautious or is it going to be bold? The question for the government and for those seeking to impact its policy, its legislative or funding priorities is, what will it do? How will it act? I think that Paul Erickson, and many of you may have seen him speaking at the press club a couple of weeks ago. Traditionally, the winning party is offered a speaking spot at the National Press Club to examine and talk about the campaign. It's interesting, he's a member of the Prime Minister's left faction, and he was handpicked by the Prime Minister for the role. He urged the party to deliver on what it took to the election. And Paul Erickson is one of the best campaigners that Australia has ever seen. Read this, I think, as, people want and voted for what it said on the label. Is that what we stand for? Is that what we accept? That, I suppose, is the question for any organisation, any of you that are listening. The question for those outside looking in is, what do we do? How do we inspire? How do we encourage? How do we cajole? How do we convince this government, or indeed any government, to be bolder? There's some early signs, I think, that a number of ministers are looking to be bolder with some adventurous staffing appointments that will become clear in the coming weeks in various spaces. And a few more courageous policy statements. One of the things that I would urge everyone to do is keep a really close eye on staffing arrangements within the ministers' offices of the ministers that you need to deal with. And obviously also listen to very carefully and read very carefully any public appearances or speeches or pronouncements that ministers that you are dealing with are saying. You need to read them very carefully for any indication that they're looking at taking a different tack, perhaps, than the approach that they took before the election. So I'm just reminding everyone that if you've got any questions or comments, pop them in the Q&A box. So how do you engage with this government? Based on the result, it's fair to say that it'd really serve you and your organisation if you focus on developing. Oh, sorry, I just completely stuffed that up. Focus on developing long-term, trusted and considered relationships with advisors, ministers and backbenchers. If they are indeed in for perhaps a 6-year term, and obviously we've got to have an election before we get there, I think there's indications from some of the staffing decisions that I've heard that have not been made public yet, that some ministers are thinking long term, and I think it would be well advised. You would be well advised to. I'm not saying don't urge them to take action where things are urgent and things are pressing. So if there's a funding need, for example, where your funding's about to, run out at the end of this month, clearly that's a priority you need to jump onto. But in terms of a policy agenda or something more complex, you need to sit down with people and really talk about that. Based on an assumption, if they're going to win a third term, I think it's important that you take a considered collaborative approach. I think they will initially be cautious and they'll want trusted partners to work with. So yes, you can be combative, you can take a different position, you can argue and put an alternative view, but I would caution you not to be combative for combative's sake right now. Until you get a no or you get a talk to the hand, we're not interested, I would actually urge you to make sure that you are engaging within the Labor ministry and the wider 94 Labor caucus because there's a lot of people there to bring across to the issues and the agenda that you've got. If you do take a combative role, if you are taking something that is completely not aligned to anything that they've got on their minds or on their agenda, they probably won't necessarily want to work with you as closely as partners that they may be able to speak more cogently to or work more collaboratively with. So I think it's always appropriate to disagree, but try and find an area of mutual agreement. So it's important when you take in your issues to people that you do so with evidence that backs your position. And when you are campaigning or when you are, having a public campaign or some sort of awareness raising, think way beyond traditional media. One of the things that was really interesting about this election happened before, but for this election very much so, it you need to think way beyond traditional media. It's where a lot of the election this time was fought. Think about podcasts, influencers, backbench social media feeds. There are 64 backbenchers. How can we get into talking in their social media feeds where they're going to be networking with all sorts of people? All of those channels. We'll be doing a separate webinar on that in the coming weeks. So how can you engage in a practical sense? And again, if people have got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. So staffing changes are underway. Some ministers are reassessing staff roles, as I mentioned before. And now that they're in government for at least 3 years, there is going to be movement and there's going to be realignment. You need to wait for those things to be bedded down. There's many advisors that won't meet yet because they haven't got the contract signed. You need to revisit your engagement history. So just because you left a conversation hanging just before the election, that doesn't mean that you can pick up exactly from where you left it. I think you've got to have an honest and open conversation with those ministers or their advisors about how you're going to work from this point. What's in their minds? Yes, bring your ideas and bring your suggestions, making sure that they align as much as possible with the government's agenda, but very much ask them for their input. And in terms of watching for shifting priorities, we've already had an indication by a couple of ministers that we picked up on that some of those priorities and those directions are changing and shifting. You've really got to read very clearly and very, very in great deal of detail exactly what people are saying and read into everything that they are saying. They say they're making these public pronouncements with great intention, and it's up to us to interpret them. So align with government priorities, and I've talked about this before, but frame your agenda in government terms. What's the government trying to achieve this term? Match your pitch to their stated goals and their election commitments. Now, many of you are going to say to me, but we want them to go further. And yes, absolutely argue for that. But I think you've got to start with where do you align and then move out from there. Start at the point of agreement and then move from there to other areas. It's from that point of agreement, that point of collaboration, that you can then perhaps urge and discuss steps that might be beyond that. If there's a gap in policy or silence on your issue, particularly if some of the backbenchers that we're going to be talking to, and there's 64 of them, I keep saying it, there's a lot of them who are going to have a lot of time. I saw Ali France and Rebecca White from Tasmania, Ali France who beat Peter Dutton in his seat, and Rebecca White in Tasmania, both putting social media posts on last week or week or so ago on Instagram saying, I'm at this cafe, I'm working here, I don't have an office and I don't have any staff. Now, I think they're probably going to learn not to do that in the future because people probably came down to see them. But that's another matter. But it's a real indication that they got a blank slate. They don't even, I've got some clients and we've been emailing some MPs at email addresses which we think are going to be their email addresses. They bounced back. They just haven't been activated yet. So there's a lot of things to unravel and sort of be put into place. And as a consequence, we need to be there to be in front of people. It's by galvanizing that support base across that large group of influential backbenchers who, if you get 20 of them all singing your song in terms of what your agenda is and what your issue is or more, that's really influential. So have a think about where those people are and whether or not they can align with what you're doing. And be bandwidth aware. The government has limited, people do have limited time and capacity. There is going to be a lot of people lining up to meet. Don't assume that you're just going to get a meeting first up with the minister. You've got to make sure that, your issue helps with their objectives, and meeting with advisors, I think, is always a really good way of starting, which brings me to my next slide, starting with advisors. I will always say that I'm a former advisor myself, and I actually think that the time frame that people have, advisors are often more candid, more honest, more open than meeting with ministers and their or not the MPs, not the backbenchers, but meeting with the ministers themselves. You'll get more frequent meetings with advisors. Leverage departments. You obviously have relationships with departments, you would think, or if you don't, get to know them. And as I've said, there's a lot of people, a lot of even you've got to treat. There's 30 ministers. Obviously, there's senators and members of the House, but there are members of the House who are ministers. They still have a seat. They're still effectively a backbencher for the purposes of their own seat, which they have to retain. So, do you have an issue that's going to be relevant for them in their seat? Make sure that they know about it. So let's think about how you can build your internal advocacy and engagement. I would urge you right now is don't go straight to the crossbencher opposition. I'm not saying that you don't ever talk to them, but right now, for these next few sitting periods, I don't think you want to encourage huge disagreements with a large Labor caucus. You really want to see that Labor has considered and understands the issues that you're bringing to them before you escalate it to, or you position for a fight. It's really important. Engaging Labor-wide, as I've said, that there's, lots of ways. It could be through the committee process. It could be through events. It could be social awareness campaigns that you engage local, MPs at a local level in. What some of the dates that are coming up this year that you need to be aware of. MyEFO, some of you may have had issues that came up in the budget. You put a proposal forward and you didn't get the funding that you're expecting, but you might have been told that it may be reopened. Again, that's really important to get in front of people very quickly. Then there's the budget next year, of course, which will be open, I think, in the normal way. It'll be back to the normal scheduling. So expect to see the budget submissions possibly open in late November or December, closing at the end of January, I would expect. The sitting and non-sitting weeks, I read a story this morning that the sitting calendar is one of the sort of shortest in history, or for 20 years. That's interesting, and yes, that is the case. But there's lots of opportunities to see people. Don't think just because there's no sitting weeks, or not as many sitting weeks as we might have expected, that there's no opportunities to meet people. There is always opportunities. If you do want an event, though, I would urge you to make some approaches on that. I approached APH Events Catering just a couple of days ago on Friday about a week in October, and there are only 2 time slots in the whole building in any room available in the October sitting week. Everything prior to that was pretty much booked out. So, go and see what you can find. If there's no rooms available, then what the other option is to always go to an MP and ask whether they would sponsor your event, and then you can do that in a committee room or some other room in the building, which is always an option. So you can always usually make an event happen if you want. Let's think about Queensland now, which is many of you, I think, on the line are going to be from Queensland. So let's have a think about Queensland in particular. Obviously, in Queensland, we have LNP government, which is not the same political persuasion as the federal government. I think the relationship will be professional. I don't think you're going to want to have a shouting or a slanging match. There's going to be some issues that the government will disagree on, perhaps on around things like youth, law and order issues, although it's going to be nuanced in terms of how that might look in reality. But in reality, I think the relationship will probably be fairly cordial. Christopher Foley is actually quite a professional front person for his government, and I do think that the relationship will probably be cordial. I would think that the law and order issue may be the one that's a sticking point in terms of, the difference that we might see on the ground. So how do you position yourself if you're a Queensland-based organisation, and how do you sort of sit in between the Queensland government and a federal government? You obviously got to find some Queensland-based federal ministers. There are many of them. There's a lot more local, there's a whole lot of new backbenchers. They're going to have differences of opinion to their LNP colleagues. So it's about thinking wisely about whether or not you're going to collaborate and work with people who are going to be positive contributors to discussion and debate at a Queensland level, rather than just combative and wanting to have arguments. Most MPs understand that having cordial, collaborative conversations with their state colleagues is more, helpful than perhaps going into bat and having a big fight just to begin with. So I think that's for you to set that scene, for you to make sure that that happens. Obviously, many of the Queensland MPs don't dismiss, in your instance, in terms of Queensland organisations, people who may be on the coalition benches or independents. I think everything's in the mix there, and offering things like site visits, creating opportunities through community forums, pilot projects in their electorate, I think is the way to have a think about that. Looking for Queensland mentions in federal in the electoral election commitments. Labor made a whole lot of election commitments to during the election, which were state specific. Go back and analyse those, try and see which ones they were. If you're not sure, you'll need to pore through some of the ministers' announcements on their websites, which will be there to have a look at, or even looking at the Labor Party website, which has all of the ministerial announcements, all the election announcements as well. Building multi-level relationships, then there's going to be lots of opportunities for you to perhaps look at where there's an opportunity for joint funded initiatives. Yes, they've got different political persuasions, but I think for issues like health or infrastructure or education, where jurisdiction is shared, aligning your message across both levels of government can amplify your impact. Look at where there is opportunity to work together, and governments will generally want to work together before they start fighting. That's just sort of how it rolls. Practical and evidence-based solutions are things really important. Demonstrating how your work and your organization's work can reduce pressure on services and deliver benefits to their key constituents. And making sure that you keep communications open, even if you or your organization doesn't align with necessarily everything that they do. Again, try and find a place to start where you can agree with someone to collaborate. I think that's the point that you start with. So that's, oh, sorry, I'm just looking. We've got a couple of questions. Sorry, on every slide you're missing text on the last text box. My apologies for that. We'll circulate the slides so that you've got the whole set of slides as well. So thank you so much today for joining us. We really appreciate you joining us and being with us today. Thanks so much, Susan, for your comments. And again, if anyone wants to send me a question or connect via email, please do. Really happy to take any questions offline or anything else we can do to help you. And have a great day. It's every day is a different day. It looks like there might be a by-election in the seat of Bradfield because it's down sort of continues hovering around 20 votes between them. It's been a really fascinating few months. So I'm sure the news will continue to keep us interested and keep us on our toes. But I really thank you for your joining us today. And someone asked me, what's the YouTube channel handle? We will circulate that to everyone who registered. Claudia, I'm assuming that you registered. That's why you're here. We will circulate that, but it is via our website. If you look at the website, you can see it, but we'll also circulate it. It's the 50 Acres YouTube channel. Thank you so much and have a great day, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us.